Alright, so we're continuing on our survey of life, and we're going to delve now into the protists. So kingdom, quote-unquote, Protista. So this now, moving away from the prokaryotes, the domains of bacteria and archaea, we're going to move into the domain eukarya. And remember, eukarya now is above kingdom, like dumb King Philip can only find green snakes. Domain is the highest, and under eukarya, the domain eukarya, we have 4 kingdoms, quote unquote. And in fact, Protista isn't really a kingdom anymore, but just for organizational sakes, we're going to keep it, and we'll talk about it as such. But protists tend to be eukaryotic, and many of the ones that are most interesting to us are going to be single-celled. So kingdom Protista, plantae and fungi, Animalia are all eukaryotes. And let's look at Protista now as a kind of catch-all kingdom. Because in fact, protists probably comprise many of their own kingdoms individually, and then many of them probably fall under relationships to plants, fungi, and animals. And so when you look at a phylogenetic tree like this, you can see like red algae, green algae, land plants, amoebas, and slime molds are probably more closely related to animals, and fungi or diatoms and are going to be more closely related to brown algae, apicomplexans, dinoflagellates, ciliates are all kind of grouped together. Flagellates, flagellated protozoans, these are all things we're going to talk about. So it's kind of this idea of a catch-all because it would be lots and lots of kingdoms, and that gets confusing. So we're going to just kind of throw them all in together and call them protists. So that being said, the major groups of protists that we're going to look at are grouped not taxonomically, but rather kind of by lifestyle is the way to put it. And so the groups, there's no group, right? Dumb King Philip can only find green snakes. There's no group in there as a taxonomic hierarchy. So we're going to look at different phyla and kind of group them together in a way that makes them easier to remember. So the 4 groups that we're going to study are the protozoans, the slime molds, the single-celled algae, and the multicellular algae. And in this recording, we're going to look at specifically the protozoans and the slime molds and refer to 4 groups of protozoans and then 2 groups of slime molds. Now, the protozoans consist of the flagellates, the amoebas, the apicomplexans, and the ciliates. Each of those phyla are listed. The flagellates are phylum Zoomasticophora. The amoebas are phylum Sarcodina. Apicomplexans are phylum Sporozoa, and the ciliates fall into the phylum Ciliophora. And yes, you do need to memorize all of these, and we'll work on this together to help you get this in your brain, so don't feel overwhelmed. But the protozoans, protozoa really means kind of first animals. So they are single-celled organisms that are mainly heterotrophic, though not all are, but most are. So we think of them as we first think about people first trying to categorize life, looking under the microscope and finding all these little tiny animals. Oh, look, there are these tiny animals. It's the first animals, and we'll call them protozoans. So let's go through the 4 types, or the 4 example groups. These are phyla of protozoans. Don't confuse the 4 groups of protozoans with the 4 groups of protists. So protists are protozoans, slime molds, single-celled algae, and multicellular algae, where the protozoans are the flagellates, amoebas, apicomplexans, and ciliates. Right? I'm going to try to say these words as much as I can, because only by hearing them and saying them and using them will they become familiar to you, and not so alien, not so scary. All right? So again, if we focus on the protozoans, let's look at the flagellates first, phylum Zoomasticophora. And so these are all characterized by the fact that they have 1 or more flagella. And we're familiar with flagella if we go back and review our cellular anatomy. The examples I want you to know of the flagellates from Zoomasticophora are Euglena. It is a free-living protist, meaning that it doesn't parasitize another organism. It does have chloroplasts. It is a complex cell. So I like to talk about the protists in general as being simple organisms but complex cells, because this one cell then accomplishes everything a multicellular organism needs to accomplish. This is kind of a weird one, and we're going to hear that a lot when we talk about protists in general. This is kind of weird. This is kind of a plant, but also kind of an animal. So it does have chloroplasts, so it can photosynthesize, but it also then does act like a heterotrope as well. It has an eye spot, and again, this isn't an org. It's not made of cells. This is one cell. So these are like organelles that allows it to move towards the light. And it has this flagellum, hence as a member of the flagellates. So our example of a free-living flagellate in the group Protozoan of the Protists is Euglena. Now, some flagellates, some members of Zoomastigophora, are parasitic, meaning that they need another organism to complete their life cycle. We think of them oftentimes if they're parasitizing their host, it means that they're damaging their host to their benefit. So often diseases are parasites. And so Giardia is a common flagellate that we actually can get if we drink unfiltered stream water, even here in the Pacific Northwest. So you should always filter your stream water, because if you do get Giardia, it latches onto the walls of your intestines, and it can cause extreme, severe diarrhea. And nobody wants that. So avoid this flagellate with personal experience and just study it from afar. So another parasite that I want you to be familiar with is trypanosoma, and this is the protozoan that causes a disease called sleeping sickness, which you can get. The vector is the tsetse fly, and it's often found in Africa. So it's cool because it lives in mammalian blood, and you just have some amazing micrographs here. You see a red blood cell, and then the trypanosoma right next to it there. So you can see in size it's very, very small. So those are the flagellates that I want you to know. The next group that we were talking about are the amoebas, phylum Sarcodina. And so the amoebas are like the blob. So they don't have any true static shape. They just flow like a mass of cytoplasm. So they're characterized by extreme flexibility. So they have no permanent locomotor organelles. Rather, they have what's called pseudopods. So this extension of cytoplasm that is moving towards one direction here towards the right is a false foot, a pseudopod. Pseudo meaning false, pod meaning foot. So they're like the blob, if you're familiar with that from American culture monster movies. So the amoeba, then, what it literally does is flow around its food and engulf it into a huge vacuole. So here you have an amoeba engulfing what's called a paramecium, which is a ciliate, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. I don't know why that paramecium isn't running for its life. Maybe it's dead already. But literally you can see as this thing engulfs it by flowing around it and then digesting it. So kind of a tough way to go. Some amoebas can cause disease, so they are. That's another reason to be interested in how they interact with us. Now, the next group is all parasitic, and these are the apicomplexans. And the apicomplexan that I want you to know as an example is called Plasmodium. So Plasmodium is in the phylum Sporozoa. It is an apicomplexan, and it is the cause of the disease malaria, which is something that is very, very prevalent. And the thing about Plasmodium, which if you look at the electron micrograph on the right, you can see where this awkward name of apicomplexans come from. So it has the apex of the cell, it has this complex. So they call it an apicomplexan. Sometimes the names are practical. But that is how it then penetrates the red blood cells, and that is part of its life cycle. So in specifically Plasmodium, it travels between humans and mosquitoes. And that's why when you read about the research that is working on combating the spread of this disease, oftentimes it involves lots of mosquito research and potentially even genetically modifying mosquitoes to help control the spread of this disease. Now, the final group of protozoans that we're looking at are the ciliates. So the ciliates then are well named because they are covered with cilia. And here we have Stentor on the left and the paramecium on the right. So you can see Stentor has that kind of looks like a blurry area up at the top of the horn-shaped cell. That's actually creating its cilia, waving, and remember cilia are like little tiny oars all moving in coordination. And it creates currents that draw food particles to the mouth, quote-unquote, of the single-celled organism. Paramecium is the same way. It has this oral groove that creates currents of water that bring it to the cell mouth. But again, remember, this is one cell. Very complex single cell. But it's covered by cilia, and we'll look at these in the lab. As it moves, all those cilia are beating to move it through the water. Again, this is weird stuff. Paramecium technically have two nuclei. So they have what's called a micronucleus and a macronucleus, as you can see in the cartoon here. But in fact, their sexual reproduction cycle involves going through like a meiotic division and kind of scrambling their genes up a little bit, and then they actually, in conjugation, they exchange micronuclei. So again, if you can think it, it's out there, and that's kind of the point of looking at all these different kinds of life, because sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and there's a lot of weird stuff out there in the world. Now, the next group that we're going to look at, those are our protozoans, right? So our first group is protozoans, and we break that into 4 subgroups: the flagellates, amoebas, apicomplexans, and the ciliates. The next group that we're going to look at is the slime molds. So the slime molds were originally thought to be fungi, but we found that they're different enough that they deserve their own category. But they are big decomposers. So the slime molds, the first type of slime mold is called a plasmodial slime mold, and this is phylum Myxomycota. And when you look at here, you see this yellow slimy stuff on a log. It's helping to break down that log. It's a decomposer. But in fact, this is one giant cell. It's one multinucleate cytoplasmic mass. And so this will grow and feed, but like all of this stuff flowing through all those small rivulets of slime are nuclei. And so it's a very unusual organism, very cool. So this is phylum Myxomycota, the plasmodial slime molds. And we're going to contrast that then with another very unusual organism called a cellular slime mold. And this is phylum Acrasiomycota. So the weird thing about the cellular slime molds, and the example we're going to use here is called Dictyostelium, is that they go through a very unusual life cycle. They go through 3 stages in their life cycle. In the first stage, they are an amoeba-like organism, single cell, that it feeds, eats small detritus, bacteria, what have you, and they can aggregate, go through sexual reproduction. If conditions are reversed, they'll actually, that aggregate of amoebas will form a migrating colony that looks like a slug. And so you can see the slug picture here on the lower right. And so this thing will then crawl away like a slug, reach a certain destination for whatever signals it's receiving from its environment, and then it will actually transform itself into something that's much more like a plant, grow a stalk that has these fruiting bodies on it, and spread spores. From the spores emerge the single-celled amoeba stage again. So, you know, is it an amoeba? Is it a multicellular animal? Is it a fungus? Is it a plant? It's all of the above. It's just really, really weird. So, but it's a great organism for study because, you know, one of the big questions in biology is how do multicellular organisms coordinate all the different cells in their body? And here's an organism that goes from being one cell to being a multicellular organism. So how do you decide, like, well, I'm going to be on top and you're going to take the rear and you're going to be on the bottom. We're all going to walk on top of you. It's very, very interesting, and it's a great model system for that kind of stuff. So that is our quick and very intense look at our first 2 groups of protists, the protozoans and the slime molds. And again, the protozoans we're going to break down into 4 common types: the flagellates, phylum Zoomastigophora; the amoebas, phylum Sarcodina; the apicomplexans, phylum Sporozoa; the ciliates, phylum Ciliophora; and then our 2 groups of slime molds, the plasmodial slime molds, phylum Myxomycota, and the cellular slime molds, which are phylum Acrasiomycota.